So welcome everyone to our professional learning session on reclaiming the narrative. My name is Linda Burrows, and I just wanted to welcome you today to this wonderful session in which we are partnering with both the Arizona Department of Education Academic Standards Unit, the Arizona Department of Education Office of Indian Education, the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center, and the Administration for Native Americans. Again, make sure you've got your first and last name changed on your name, and I will be asking you to type that into the chat at the end of the session, where you will then receive an email from me to verify your attendance. And at that point in time, that's when you can go ahead and print out your certificates. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Helen Thomas to introduce ourselves.
Thank you, Linda. So in just a moment, we'll each take some time to introduce ourselves and ask you to introduce yourself in the chat. But we want to take a few moments to engage with some land acknowledgements. We are going to ask you to include land acknowledgements in your introduction in the chat. And so if you're not sure whose land you're currently learning and living on, you can use the QR code on the screen and it'll pull up a map where you can put in your zip code, your address, the city you live in. And we know that some people in the space may not have done land acknowledgements before, but we find it really important and critical to center the land and Indigenous peoples when we're starting an event like this. And so I'm going to offer just a quick land acknowledgement for the Arizona Department of Education, and then we will go ahead and introduce ourselves. But the Arizona Department of Education acknowledges that we sit on the ancestral homelands of the Akimel O'odham and Peepash peoples, and without their past, present, and future caretaking of the land, we would not be able to live as guests and survive on these lands today. We also want to acknowledge the large urban Native population that finds its home in the Phoenix metropolitan area and just center their knowledge and contributions as well. Linda dropped in the chat an additional link, or she will in just a moment, an additional link that's from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture that you can use to learn more about land acknowledgements and honoring land. There's a great video that we would show if we had a little bit more time, but we really want to jump into today's topic. So we will be sharing that link and you'll find it in the collection of resources that we share as well at the end of this series. And so as we are introducing ourselves, we want to ask that you please share in the chat your name, your role, your organization, and again, the tribal nation closest to you or on whose ancestral homelands you currently live and work. And you could choose to look up lands that you're from if you're not originally from these lands, or where your school site is located or where you live. We're really open to any of those. We just want to really consider our relationships to land as we enter this space. And so I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. I'm Petu Washte, Helen Wape, Thomas Machape, Kasto, Malakota Kasto, Matakuyepi Chante Washte Nape Chiuzapi. So hello, my name is Helen Thomas. I am the Professional Learning Coordinator for the Office of Indian Education. I am Hunkpapa Lakota, a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. And in my traditional Lakota introduction that was taught to me by my grandmother, who was a lifelong educator and a Lakota language educator back home, I said, I greet you with good feelings in my heart. That's how I was taught to introduce myself and really start to build relationships in a good way. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Linda to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Burrows, and I am the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages here at the Department of Education. And I am very excited to have you all here today to participate in this professional learning environment. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Melita Yazzie, who will introduce herself.
Yeah, it's Shea, Melita Yazzie, and Shea. Toy Kathleen and Shea, Kiani Bashashin, Bitordni, Dashachedo, Tudichini, Dashanala, because Aga Aya Assange, Adon they say Bitord, they are Yusanasha. Hello, my name is Melita Yazzie. I introduced myself in Navajo with my 4 clans I am born for water running together. I am born for the towering house plan. And my paternal grandfathers are Bitterwater, and my maternal grandfathers are Dearwater. And that is how I am a Diné woman. And now we'll let Manny introduce himself.
Guati, how past awi chaimish, how past aukini chaimish. Shinome aku mesta Petri I esta Yaka hanu. Yaka kuka nish hanu ama. Ushrach hanu. Guati, how past aukini chaimish, how past awi chaimish. Statumo chaimish, stakuich chaimish. Guati. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Pino. Most people know me as Manny. I am a retired professor in American Indian Studies and Sociology. I've taught here in Arizona for 28 years at the collegiate level, 4 years at Arizona State University, and the remaining tenure of my career at Scottsdale Community College, which is on the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and share this important educational opportunity for you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for taking a moment to introduce yourselves. And thank you to everyone that's putting your introductions in the chat. It's really important to us that not only we know who's in the room, but you all know who you're in the room with and who you're learning with today. We really want you to be able to build relationships with each other and feel like you're a part of a larger community of educators who are motivated and dedicated to teaching about this history. And so with that, because we will be asking you to engage with each other and to go into small groups at one point, engage in the chat, we do want to set out a few community agreements. The first being that we're all here to learn. Again, we really believe that you're not only learning from us in this space, but you can learn from each other and with each other. And that's very important to us as we are designing this session. The next agreement is that everybody brings valuable knowledge and experiences. And with that agreement comes the understanding that different people have different experiences when it comes to this topic, and we want to honor the various knowledge and lived experiences that you're bringing into the space as well. The next agreement is to take care of yourself and others. That extends everything from if you see someone has a question in the chat and you know of a resource or you have the answer to their question, please respond to them in the chat, engage with each other. But we also want to acknowledge that take care of yourself and others is our approach to being trauma informed in this session. We want to offer a trigger warning that some of the historical photographs or topics that we're talking about can be difficult. And we want to encourage you to take care of yourself always. So if you need to step away, if you need to take a break, we want to give you the space to do that. We also want to specifically honor the Indigenous educators we have in our space. And we want to recognize that you already have a lot of knowledge around this topic because you likely have some lived experiences in some way tied to this topic. So we do want to honor you. We want to acknowledge that we have a limited amount of time. So please expect and accept non-closure. This is just a beginning point to learning about this topic and to teaching about it. And so we hope that you'll continue in this journey with us. Even after our time together today, you can always reach out, ask questions. All four of us are happy to provide support in any way that you might need. And so we will be sharing our contact information at the end of today's session. I'm going to pass it back to Linda to go over our agenda.
Can you advance the slide, Helen?
Oh, I'm so sorry, everybody. It was paused. These are the community agreements for anyone that I apologize wants to read as we're going along. That would be helpful. You will get a copy of these slides though. So if you do want to go back and look at these agreements in further detail, we will share these at the end. Thank you, Linda.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So we've done our welcome and introductions. We're going to go over a history of the Native American boarding schools provided by Professor Pino. We will then be taking a break and looking at then the lasting impacts of the Native American boarding schools, and then a closing. Can you advance to the next slide? There we go. That's the agenda I was looking for. So we have 4 learning outcomes that we have identified for today's professional development learning. First, we'd like for teachers will demonstrate an increased knowledge of the socio-political context of the Native American boarding schools, especially with regards to federal Indian policies. Teachers will demonstrate an increased understanding of the social, emotional, mental, and physical impacts of Native American boarding schools. We also hope that teachers will be able to demonstrate an increased knowledge of how the legacies of historical trauma have impacted Native American students, families, and communities today. And then lastly, we will be demonstrating an understanding of why learning about historical trauma is necessary to be a trauma-informed practitioner. So we want this to be as responsive as possible. We will be using the chat and a couple of other means to do this. But first, we wanted to just kind of get in touch with you and kind of center our learning today around what and where you are coming from and the place in which you are coming from. So we'd like for you to share your answers in the chat, if you could, for me, about what do you already know about Native American boarding schools? And then the second question is, what is one question you have regarding Native American boarding schools? And so we are going to take just a few minutes to do this. So take a moment and type your answers into the chat, please.
Thank you to those that are sharing in the chat. Really appreciate the vulnerability you're showing by acknowledging that you might not, you're coming in maybe with very little background experience or knowledge around this topic. And we appreciate that because it really helps us, again, be responsive to where you're at in your learning journey and recognizing what's going to be the most important things to share. These are great questions, and we will have time at the end for some more informal questions and answers. So please keep these in mind. And if there's a question that still has not been answered, there will be another opportunity for you to pose additional questions, and we'll have Professor Pino answering some of those at the end of today's session. People are interested in where they were located. Are they still in use today? How many children have been sent to these boarding schools and when? These are really great questions. Wow, thank you so much. Were all children required to go to these schools? What's become of the schools? And as Professor Pino will say in his video presentation that we will be showcasing today, this is a very timely topic. So I think a lot of these questions will be answered and are really great to ground ourselves in. So with that, please continue to share any questions, any thoughts or wonderings you might be having in the chat. And we really, again, encourage you to use the chat as a way to engage with each other and to engage with us throughout the session. So if a question comes up or you have an aha moment, you know of a resource that elaborates on what we're discussing within the workshop, please go ahead and drop it in the chat. We will be sharing out the chat transcript after as well. And so with that, we want to just put these questions that we asked you to consider in preparation for today's session. I know they were sent out in the beginning or in our reminder email, but these are our two kind of overarching essential questions that we hope you'll be able to reflect on throughout our session today. The first one being, how does this information change the way you view your role as an educator within the American public schooling system? And the second question is, what are our responsibilities towards Indigenous or Native peoples as educators within the American public schooling system? So we hope that these resonate with you. We hope these help you make connections from today's topic to your specific role and responsibilities as an educator here in the state of Arizona. And so with that, I think we're going to drop these questions in the chat just so you can keep them in mind as we move through today's session. But I am going to pass it over to Molita Yazi to provide a brief introduction.
Okay, so an essential piece of this training is to have an understanding of political activities over the course of American history. And so we are honored to have Manuel Pino as our expert to explain these intricate happenings that have happened. Emmanuel introduced himself briefly just now, but I kind of want to add to what he really is passionate about. So Manuel researches and addresses environmental issues as they impact American Indians and Indigenous peoples throughout the world. His major focus is nuclear fuel chain, in particular uranium mining and milling, and its impact on Indigenous peoples. He has also served as a delegate to numerous international conferences, environmental conferences at the United Nations, and he currently sits on numerous boards of environmental organizations throughout the United States. And he is also working on health issues related to radiation exposure and in communities opposing nuclear waste storage and future mining. In 2008, Manuel received the Nuclear Free Future Award in Munich, Germany for his activism. And we are so honored to have him as our expert, as I mentioned before. And thank you, Manny, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise in this training series. And now Helen will get us started on some of Mr. Manuel Pino's presentation. Helen?
Thank you. And yes, thank you so much, Professor Pino, for being in the space with us today. But he was kind enough to create a very comprehensive and informative video presentation, which we will be showing clips of throughout today's session. And we're choosing to show clips because we recognize that there is a long history, as Molita said, of political actions and documents and primary sources that should be looked at in order to understand this topic. But we wanted to provide it to you in some chunks and break it up with time for reflection so that you all can make meaning from the really valuable information that Professor Pino is sharing. So with that, I'm going to play just the first about 8 minutes of this video presentation so that we can get a broad overview of this topic. And please let me know if anyone's unable to hear the audio in the chat.
Guazi haupa hanarcht. Shinome hech. Esta. Ako mesh hanu. Ushrach hanu. Yakakuka nish hanu. Awa e haupast awi Chinese. Haupast awi Chinese. Guazi. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Pino. I am from the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. I am a retired professor of sociology and American Indian studies. I taught for 5 years at Arizona State University and resumed my career at Scottsdale Community College on the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. I taught for 28 years in the two disciplines, and I am now working on numerous projects involving mostly natural resource development on Indian land. But I am thankful for the invitation to present on federal Indian boarding schools for the Reclaiming the Narrative, Teaching the Truth About Native American Boarding Schools initiative that we are addressing here this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me. In my presentation, I have highlighted the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, which was just completed in May 11th, 2022 of this year. The directive for the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report came from Secretary of Interior Deb Holland from the Pueblo of Laguna. Secretary of Interior Holland assigned Assistant Secretary of Interior for Indian Affairs Brian Newland to conduct the investigative report. The investigative report was actually initiated about 1 year to the date on June 22nd, 2021. So one of the assignments that I was given was to draw correlations from federal Indian history, particularly federal Indian law and policy, and how those laws and policies are correlated with the federal Indian boarding school experience. The historical overview of the federal Indian boarding schools includes several important points. The federal Indian boarding school system consisted of 408 schools across 37 states or then territories, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. Federal Indian policies of Indian territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation through American education was the primary goal. Funding for federal Indian boarding school system included federal funds through congressional appropriations and funds obtained from tribal trust accounts. The federal Indian boarding school system used militarized and identity alteration methodology to assimilate American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiian children. Federal Indian boarding schools utilized manual labor of American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian children to upkeep and compensate for poor conditions of school facilities and a lack of financial report from the federal government and other funding entities. Based on initial findings of the federal Indian boarding school is a work in progress. It remains under investigation. The May 22nd report that was just concluded is just the foundation or a stepping stone for further research and investigation that is yet to come through this mandate from the Department of Interior. The flagship school, or the first school that was established, is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that was situated in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The founder of the main founder and initiator was a Civil War veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, who testified before Congress on the necessity of a federal Indian boarding school system to further assimilate Indian children. It was the perspective of Mr. Pratt that in order to fully conduct and initiate assimilative programs like the boarding school, we have to start with the children. So Mr. Pratt, in his testimony before Congress, emphasized the need for the boarding school program, and later what was called the outing program that would place Indian students with non-Indian families during summer vacations to eliminate the possibility of children returning home to their homelands on Indian reservations. Initially, the policy was established under the assimilative principle of kill the Indian and save the man. The principle of Indians are supposed to be equals of Euro-Americans. Children were to be immersed into mainstream America under the belief that Indians were a vanishing race, that we would somehow take these assimilation initiatives and vanish into mainstream America. Another key point of emphasis is saving the children. Children can be saved with cultural transformation, saved from what was determined as the negative, savage life on the reservation. Right? This type of language is cited throughout the Federal Indian Boarding School investigative report.
Okay, so that provided us a really nice overview of the historical overview of federal Indian boarding schools. And we want to acknowledge that Professor Pino's video is about an hour and a half long, and he goes into detail about the institutions that defined the unique trust relationship between tribal nations and the United States government, and why that was the impetus for federal Indian boarding schools, and really underlies a lot of the various policies. And so in these slides, we have taken the time to find the exact timestamps where he begins to speak about each of these various institutions. And when you get a copy of these slides, you can click directly on these links to learn more and about the specific institutions in detail. For the sake of time today, we will only be going into a few. So I'm going to pass it off to Linda for the next slide.
So the history between the federal government and Native American nations is long and really in depth, especially with regards to court cases, acts, and acts of Congress, as well as executive branch acts. And so we've just taken a few here and created a timeline of some of the items that we're going to cover during Professor Pino's video. But again, there are many acts that you can look at. I'm putting in the chat actually, and this is a Department of Justice timeline, which really goes through even more than ones that deal with the Native American boarding schools. But again, it's just that idea that this is a really long history of ideas and thoughts of how the federal government supposedly dealt with Indigenous peoples and how that varied and changed over time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Melita.
Okay. As Linda and Helen just alluded to, there are many facets that contributed to the federal Indian boarding school policy. There are, however, a few that we picked out that we'll be highlighting for the sake of time, as Helen mentioned. And these are the 5 here. Again, there are so many more. Please take the time to review Mr. Pino's whole recording and its supplement, the timestamp document for viewing and the viewing guide to get more familiar with these laws. So the 5 that we're going to be focusing on and kind of highlighting, because I mean, like I said, it was hard to pick the 5, but for time purposes, we had to kind of narrow this down. The first is the 1819 Indian Civilization Fund Act, and then the second is the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Termination Act of 1953, and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, and then the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act That number 5 kind of leads into Deb Holland's investigation, and it kind of speaks to what we're going to encounter as we go along, as we find more and more in Deb Holland's investigation.
Thank you, Melita. So we're going to start with our first clip. Most of these clips are going to be just a few minutes long. And as we said, we will be pausing to give you some moments to reflect and really make meaning of the information that's being shared. So I'll go ahead and start this one.
The federal Indian boarding school system. Beginning in 1819 with the Indian Civilization Act Fund. These were some of the first appropriated federal funds to establish Indian boarding schools. The congressional intent was to make Indians extinct through civilization, assimilation, and land dispossession. And these appropriated funds would establish schools, assimilative principles as a foundation that would eventually lead to this systematic process of federal Indian boarding schools by the mid-1800s. The first act of
So we just wanted to be able to provide the quick clip that shows you why Mr. Pino started with the 1819 Indian Civilization Fund Act, and then we'll
Congress that used
now look at the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 in this next clip.
what the Indian Reorganization Act, the congressional intent of the Indian Reorganization Act was to make tribal governments structured similar to the US, much like what the Cherokees had already done in the early 1800s. Establishing the tribal governmental system with a legislative branch that we today call tribal councils, a judicial branch that we call tribal courts, executive branches of tribal government where we have an executive leader and his or her administration, referencing the executive branch leader as sometimes president, chairman, chairperson, governor, principal chief, among others. The Indian Reorganization Act introduced written constitutions, tribal constitutions, right, which to this very day still have a significant impact in governance of our native nations, of our native tribal governments. The Indian Reorganization Act introduced elections by majority rule, where many tribes to this very day, like in state elections, like in federal elections, elect their legislative and executive leaders. Right? So the Indian Reorganization Act also ended the allotment period. It put an official end to allotment. The Indian Reorganization Act also reorganized Indian education, eliminating numerous institutions in the federal Indian boarding school system and creating day schools, which were schools that were situated on the reservation, not requiring students to live and board at the school. They could go home at the end of the day and return the next morning, right? As a result of the Indian Reorganization Act, right? Many tribes to this very day have their tribal governmental structure intact from the Indian Reorganization Act models, right? Although tribal governments have become a lot more independent and autonomous by more recent federal legislation, which I'll explain here in a couple of minutes. There's still that guardian ward plenary power principle, which I'll explain in Supreme Court decisions in as the next institution. Okay. The Termination Act of 1953.
And so we really wanted to include that clip, especially the wording there at the end, where Mr. Pino is talking about the guardian ward relationship. And so we want to take a moment to pause and give you just a minute or so to process. You don't need to share in the chat unless you'd like to. Oh, perfect. And but just to consider, what are these policies, just these few policies that we've explored in depth a little bit, tell you about the relationship between the United States and tribal/native nations. Just considering what those policies demonstrate in the relationship. Thank you to those who are sharing in the chat. You're more than happy to share. For the sake of time, we're going to keep moving forward because we do have a number of clips we want to get to. But we encourage everyone to share in the chat if they'd like.
We will have a time for questions at the end of the session. So for those of you, I think someone's got their hand raised, we will give you that opportunity at the end of the session.
Thank you, Linda. So the next clip we're going to explore is the Termination Act of 1953, and I will start the clip so we can hear directly from our community expert.
Termination Act of 1953. Under the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, Congress passed the Termination Act, which resulted in over 100 tribes being terminated. They lost their land areas. They lost their identity as Native people, as citizens of their tribes. They were terminated and became citizens of the states in which they resided in. Federal funding to these terminated tribes was eliminated. Right? So it was basically the federal government telling these 100 Native nations/tribes, you're no longer Indians anymore. We're going to make you have the same rights and responsibilities as all of the other American citizens, right? Meanwhile, dispossessing those reservations, right? And taking away another schematic way to dispossess and take Indian land, right? The termination policy is considered one of the most disastrous policies in the modern era. The 100 tribes that were terminated since, well, let me backtrack. The termination period extended from 1953 till about the early 1970s when President Nixon ended the termination policy. And one of the mandates of the Nixon administration was that these tribes could be re-recognized as federal trust Native nations/tribes. And many tribes since the 1970s have petitioned the federal government for re-recognition as a result of being terminated under the 1953 Act. Right? Can you imagine, as a Native person, as a member of one of these terminated tribes, similar to removal, you're no longer Indians anymore. You no longer have a reservation. We're ending federal appropriated funds, right? I mean, again, it's like another broken treaty, right? Being made a promise of protection and guardianship by this country, right? Which I'll explain that correlation in a little more detail under the Supreme Court cases. The Native American Graves Protection and
So we felt that that particular act again highlights this very nuanced and longstanding relationship between the federal government and Native nations. So I'm going to pass it off to Linda, I believe, to introduce the next clip.
So the next clip that we're going to look at and hear from Professor Pino is the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. So I will let him explain the act in detail to you.
Lastly, the Indian Self-Governance Act of 1994 is kind of a spin-off of the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. These two pieces of legislation, almost 20 years apart, gave Indian tribes greater independence and greater autonomy in contracting with the federal government for healthcare, education, improved infrastructure on reservations, right? Tribes can now negotiate without the federal government's assistance in establishing businesses on the reservation, in working with like utility companies to create easements across the reservation, such as electric lines, fiber optic lines, with energy corporations who have easements across reservations for oil and gas pipelines, for example, right? The tribe is given a greater level of autonomy and independence in creating those negotiated interests on their behalf. Prior to 1975, right, you'd always have the federal government sitting at the table overseeing these negotiations in regards to economic development, energy development, and other forms of governance that Indian tribes are allowed, Indian nations are allowed, right? So every one of these pieces of legislation that you see on the slide have an impact on either land dispossession, assimilation, a deterioration of rights, right? Without some form of negotiation, right? Without some form of input from Native nations and Native tribes, right? Especially after 1975, when Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination Act and gave tribes greater autonomy, greater independence to oversee their own tribal governments.
Now we have one final act that we want to explore before we look a little bit at Supreme Court cases and executive orders, and that is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act of 1990. And as Molita mentioned, this one is very directly related to some of the more recent efforts around federal Indian boarding schools and the investigative report.
The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is cited throughout the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigative report, due to the fact that in the 21-22 study, numerous Indian graves were found on these former Indian boarding school lands, many in unmarked graves in these cemeteries. And under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, the act mandates that any human remains, funerary objects, items of cultural patrimony that are found in federal institutions like boarding schools, like universities and museums, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where thousands of Native American human remains sit in vaults in that institution, right? In 1990, when Congress passed NAGPRA, one of the major provisions or mandates of the act, of the legislation, was to return those remains back home for proper reburial. Taking the remains out of institutions like universities, museums, the Smithsonian, and now graves being found on former federal Indian boarding schools, to repatriate those remains and sacred items back to the tribes. Right? So NAGPRA is cited as possibly returning some of these, exhuming and interning many of these unmarked grave sites and Indian cemeteries found on federal Indian boarding schools, and returning them to their native homelands for proper reburial. This is one of the outcomes of this first volume of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, in using NAGPRA to get the remains of these Indian children home and returned for proper reburial. The Indian Reclaiming Regulatory.
Okay, so again, we want to give you about a minute or so to go back to that same reflection question around what do these additional policies that we just listened to and learned about continue to tell you about that relationship. And again, you're welcome to share in the chat. We appreciate those that shared before, but you're definitely not required to. This is just time to consider. Appreciate the quick one-word reflections. I think that's definitely what we're trying to get at, is just what's coming up for you as you listen to the history of these policies that have been in place. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Linda to introduce the next clip.
So now we're going to look at the Supreme Court cases, and there are many, many Supreme Court cases that deal with federal policy towards Native American nations, going all the way back to treaties with England before the United States even became a country. We're going to have Professor Pino's focused on two of them, with a third one as well that really focus on Native American boarding schools. So I will let him tell the details of those two Supreme Court cases.
The last area of the institutions that define the trust relationship is the United States Supreme Court. These three cases, known as the Marshall Trilogy, Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, and Worcester v. Georgia, are considered some of the foundations, the cornerstones of federal Indian law. Known as the Marshall Trilogy due to the fact that Chief Justice John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time these cases were litigated. Trilogy meaning three. Right? Marshall was the Chief Justice, just as John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court today. In the first case, Johnson v. McIntosh,
and so again, we wish that we had enough time to go into the detail of all three of those cases and the many others that have continued to define tribal sovereignty and the trust relationship. But within our viewing guide that we'll be sharing, we do provide timestamps for each of those three cases, and we really encourage everybody to listen closely. The benefit of a video is that we can pause, slow down, listen again if we need clarification. And so we encourage you to use the viewing guide to get more details about how Supreme Court cases also defined this relationship.
Cited in.
Lastly, we'll be playing a clip that talks about executive orders as an additional way that this relationship has been defined. And we really appreciate the detail that Mr. Pino gives to our specific context in our state of Arizona. So we'll listen to this one.
Executive orders made by presidents. One of the best examples is that here in Arizona, 21 out of the 22 reservations were created by executive orders of numerous presidents. We have one treaty tribe, the Navajo Nation, where they signed the Treaty of 1868 with the United States government, and based upon that treaty have their land base, the largest Indian reservation in land area in the United States, about the size of West Virginia. Right? All the 21 other tribes in Arizona had their reservations created by executive order. Right? As you see here in the state of Arizona, right, we have 22 tribes, right? And their land base created by numerous presidents historically.
Okay, so before we jump in
We're going to give
to,
you just, one last alone zone processing time. So we showed you court cases, but and executive branch orders, but again, looking at all the pieces of the federal government that had a part and a hand in this guardian ward relationship between the US and tribal nations.
and I think one thing that if we were able to watch the entire video, that you would definitely be able to take away from what Mr. Pino shares is just pushing back against this misconception that this relationship gave rights to Native nations, but in fact, these various institutions, what they were doing was affirming the inherent rights that Native nations have always had to relationships with the land, to sustain their lifeways and their cultures. And we, I know at the Office of Indian Education, very much support that idea of acknowledging sovereignty in that way.
We're going to turn it over to Melita now to introduce the last aspect of it.
Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, we're going to listen to Professor Pino discuss the assimilative effects of federal boarding school. And some of these slides here kind of describe the web of actors and social institutions that contributed to assimilative aspects of the federal Indian boarding school policy.
Thank you, Melita.
Citing the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative report, these are some of the social institutions that were involved in the creation of federal Indian boarding schools. Congress, the Department of War, and later the Department of Interior, the Indian Office under Interior, Indian agents, farmers, teachers, matrons, clerks, which were part of the boarding school personnel and staff, Indian judges, police, agency, and agency chiefs of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Also religious institutions, as well as Congress. Right? Here's an interesting quote by former president or president during this historical time period of boarding schools, Teddy Roosevelt. And he stated, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are. And I shouldn't inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principles than the average Indian." Teddy Roosevelt, one of our presidents. That was the sentiment of mainstream America during this boarding school era. And there are interesting citations and quotes by presidents throughout the federal Indian Boarding School Initiative report. from Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, that all emphasize that territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation is a major way that this country could get to our lands and territories and change our people, assimilate our people to the extent that this government saw what was best for us under the guise of kill the Indian and save the man. One of the things Pratt did at the federal Carlisle Indian School, the first boarding school established, was send a series of before and after pictures of Native students upon arrival at the schools and after their period of time at places like Carlisle. One of the most photographed individuals is a Navajo man from New Mexico by the name of Tom Torlino, who here you see his picture upon arrival and later at the Carlisle Indian School. An assimilationist, Mr. Torlino eventually became an Indian policeman and assimilated to many of the principles established at the Carlisle Indians. Again, as I emphasized, a military structure of these boarding schools was extremely evident. Everything was done by a military time clock. The vocational training followed a military structure. Even the academics and curriculum of teaching Indian students arithmetic, writing, English, followed a strict military structure. Here you see the Phoenix Indian School military band and cadets, right, in formation right here in Phoenix, Arizona. Some of the federal Indian boarding school policies found in the report highlighted by Assistant Secretary Newland and researchers who undertook this initiative. Again, re-emphasizing the primary goal was to make parents and children eventual strangers to one another. Children were to never return to their traditional homelands on reservations. After 1871, Congress passed mandatory laws to compel parents to send their children to federal Indian boarding schools. In the early 1890s, Congress passed compulsory school attendance laws, which left families with no consent. In 1898, a law was passed to take Indian children from their parents so they can place them in schools. Again, without legal recourse from the individual parents or the Native nation/tribes themselves. Here's a picture of children taken to the Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas. Look at how young, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds taken from their parents forcibly, right? Sometimes with military and police assistance, right? You talk about the intergenerational trauma, the historical trauma of being separated from your parents, right? Over an extended time period. To the extent here in Arizona that in 1891, Hopi fathers, 19 Hopi fathers, were sent to Alcatraz Federal Prison for refusing to send their children to federal Indian boarding school. They were incarcerated for 14 months in Alcatraz. Similarly, in the boarding schools, Indian students faced corporal punishment for not following policies, especially the runaways. And I skipped the slide. I have cited here the federal Indian boarding school attendance and physical status of Northern Plains tribes in a study done in 2018 by Ursula Running Bear, who is cited in the Federal Indian Boarding School report. And in her findings in 2018, in interviews and interaction with attendees, present day attendees of boarding school education, many now as elderly individuals, Running Bear found that attendees had lower physical health status as compared to non-attendees. Adult attendees were 3 times more likely to have cancer, twice the level of tuberculosis, 95% experienced high cholesterol, 81% experienced diabetes, 61% experienced anemia, 60% gallbladder disease. And the risk of post-traumatic stress syndrome resulting in depression, unsolved grief, loneliness, despair, resulting in a greater suicide rate. So again, going back to that example or issue of historical trauma, being separated from your parents, right? The outing program, disallowing you to go home over summer, right? And many times parents didn't have the economic resources to have their students return over the summer vacation, summer break, due to the fact that these boarding schools were situated very long distances from the homelands of these children on reservations, right? So it was virtually impossible for parents and their children to see one another, right, once they were taken to boarding school. Right? The loneliness, the depression, right, has resulted today in greater rates of suicide, greater rates of drug abuse and alcoholism, right? Domestic violence, right, and other infringements upon Indian children and their lives, right? The historical trauma. Think about what just happened in Uvalde, Texas, right? Or school shootings that have become commonplace in our history, right? These children, right? These parents are never going to forget what happened, right? At Parkland, at Sandy Hook, at Uvalde, and Columbine, numerous others. Well, you can imagine what these students and parents went through in the capacity of not being able to love and see one another throughout their existence. Dying, I skipped a slide that had pictures of burial grounds at Carlisle, where 53 grave sites in the study were found. Right? And of these grave sites, many were unmarked. Right? And having to exhume the bodies to make determination of the tribal affiliation, the individual background of these students that were found in these cemetery sites, which has been given a priority, right? As I said, using the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to repatriate these human remains back to their Aboriginal homelands for proper reburial. So these are situations that we had to live with historically in the past and continue to live with to this very day, right? The emphasis on vocational training involving manual labor of children, the labor of Indian children constituted a violation of Indian child labor laws during the boarding schools period in most states. The Miriam report presented this in 1928, that these were violations of child labor laws of the day. The labor of male students included carpentry, blacksmithing, lumbering, fertilizing, irrigation development, welding, and railroad work. Labor for female students included cooking, sewing, laundry, ironing, garment making, including clothing for themselves. These students facilitated the boarding schools. They fed themselves, they provided clothing, grew their own food, right? Worked in jobs during summer vacation for the betterment and contributing toward the growth of this country. The priority in the vocational training and these labor, forced labor environments were prioritized over academics. Right? And again, as I stated earlier, right, the military structure, right, in the labor and the lack of federal governmental appropriations through funding, right, as children facilitated the boarding schools, required less federal funding from the federal government itself. So another unjust policy as a result of the structure of federal Indian boarding schools. The academic curriculum emphasized the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, prioritizing learning proper manners, mores, norms of mainstream America. The arts and music and religious studies and sports were many times the only outlet that students found in enjoying their stay in these federal Indian boarding schools. The assimilation policy of kill the Indian and save the man. Eliminate all forms of traditional cultural identity, spiritually and religion, right? This was intact on the boarding school themselves and on reservations as well, right? As the example of imprisoning Hopi fathers in the federal Indian prison in Alcatraz, right? You know, where do you think our names come from today, right? Indian people with names like Smith, Jones, Johnson, right? They came from the boarding schools. They took away our priority, our Indian identity. As I introduced myself to begin this lecture, I told you my Indian name, Petri. I told you my clans, Sun Clan and Red Corn Clan, right? These were the type of identities that were stripped from these students. The spiritual, cultural, ceremonial realm that helped identify who they were as Indian children and Indian people. The forced conversion to Christianity. Right? We find numerous Christian denominations on Indian reservations today. Where do you think that started from? It started from colonial imposition way back in the 15, 16, 17, and 1800s, and accelerated with the children in the boarding school systems of these federal Indian boarding schools. Children were told, choose a name, choose a religion, right? And that'll be your identity from this point forward. Taking away their identity, cutting their hair, the elimination of traditional clothing, punishment for talking the language in these institutions was a major priority, as you read in the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative study. The map on the top are federal Indian boarding schools in Arizona. Arizona was the second most, or the second state with the largest number of federal Indian boarding schools at 47. Oklahoma had the most at 77, and New Mexico followed Arizona, right? So you can see where these boarding schools were situated in Arizona and where these boarding schools were situated across the United States. In this ongoing study that is ongoing by the Department of Interior under Deborah Holland and Brian Newland, are priorities to continue this full investigation identifying surviving federal Indian boarding school attendees across the United States, conducting interviews with them, sharing their experiences in these federal Indian boarding schools, and documenting them in those interview presentations. Right? Developing a specific repository of federal Indian boarding school records. Numerous records and files exist in these institutions across the United States, which still need to be researched fully in this ongoing study. Identify and engage other federal agencies to support this federal Indian boarding school initiative. Beyond the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? The Department of Education, the Bureau of Indian Education, right? Other forms of other federal governmental agencies that have a trust responsibility toward federal Indian nations and individual Indians in the United States today. Continual congressional support. We hope this continues. Right? If we have a new administration in 2024, is this initiative going to stop? When we have Congress shift after the midterm elections, will we have this continual support with a new Congress? Lastly, advancing our native language revitalization. The assimilation process has worked. Google endangered Native American languages today, and it's almost everyone. You know, I am fortunate to have grown up with my dialect language as my first language. That is not true for my children and grandchildren today. A majority of Native people today, their primary language is English. So we're at a very critical time period in history when we lose elders as valuable human resources who retain these languages today.
So we know that last clip was a little bit long, but it really gave a more thorough overview of all the policies and the conditions within the federal Indian boarding schools. We're now going to send you into some breakout rooms with around 4 to 5 people and give you some time to not just process in the alone zone like we were having you do earlier, but really in community, in relationship with each other. And so we'll be asking you to follow a talking circle protocol. And all that means is that you're intentionally allowing each person in the space an opportunity to respond to this prompt before you start having further discussion. So it's really an equitable and inclusive communication style that gives everybody the chance to share their thoughts and their connections to this topic. And then from there, once everyone has had a chance to briefly introduce themselves and respond to the question, you can, of course, have a further discussion. We're going to give you around 7-ish minutes, and we're asking you to think about this question. Again, how does this information change the way you view your role as an educator within the American public schooling system, specifically within Arizona? And just know we will be exploring those maps in further detail in part 2 of our session. So if those were interesting to you and you wanted to see more about the federal Indian boarding school sites in our state, you can definitely do that in part 2. So I'm going to drop the questions in the chat so you all can reference them. And again, we'll give you around 7 minutes and we'll give you a warning when to come back.
Record. And we will move forward. Welcome back, everybody.
Perfect. And you can see my screen, right, Linda?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
So now we'll get into the lasting impact.
Yes, and so now that we've had a grounding in the history of Native American boarding schools, we really want to focus in more on and intentionally discuss those lasting impacts. And so we just heard through those various clips, especially the last clip that we watched, about many of the immediate impacts of Native American boarding schools including forced assimilation, cultural erasure, and the more explicit abuses, violence, and psychological distress that was experienced in boarding schools. And we know that many teachers, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, are more familiar with the effects of trauma and the brain. And a lot of those experiences that Professor Pino shared could be classified today, right, as adverse childhood experiences, which we know have negative long-term impacts on brain development, and that exposure to prolonged stress can cause a dysregulated nervous system. And so we want to note today the importance of acknowledging that trauma doesn't always just happen in interpersonal instances, but can also happen on a collective or intergenerational scale. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our community partner, our expert, Molita Yazi, to speak about historical trauma and how it continues to impact our Native American students, families, communities, and nations today. Oh, you're muted, Molita.
There I am. So there's a series of clips here. So this first one discusses historical trauma from the Native American perspective, as described by Native American children. And it also talks about how it's passed on, about the populations affected, and how it is experienced.
What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it.
My dad said when they were growing up, they said, we used to play cowboys and Indians. And he started telling me this story. And we used to fight over, nobody wanted to be the Indian. And he said, I didn't think about that. We'd all play and I'd always suck it up and I'd be the Indian. But how ironic is it for a bunch of Indian children to be playing cowboys and Indians and nobody wants to be the Indian? The introduction of a destruction of culture and loss of what is good. And I asked my dad, well, why didn't anybody want to be the Indian? And I thought I knew the answer. He said, because everybody knows the Indian dies. And that already in his generation, as strong as he was, he received a message as a young child. I received the same message, that it was not good to be Indian.
Okay, so
Slavery, colonization, forced relocation, and other historically true.
I'm sorry, Molita, we are going to play through to 256. Is that still good?
yeah.
Traumatic events in generations past have lingering and profound consequences today. But what is historical trauma?
Historical trauma has to do with collective, cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally and it can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later.
Does historical trauma only affect certain groups of people?
What really helps me to help people understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people. It's articulated all over the world.
Historical trauma is widespread, affecting many communities across the globe.
Observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and in their lifetime.
Historical trauma is passed on across generations.
Okay, so when you look at historical trauma, those are the things that happen historically to a group of people, as mentioned before. So now we have intergenerational trauma, where that trauma has happened in the past. You might not have known the person who experienced the trauma, but you still feel it because it's in your DNA now. So this chart here shows intergenerational trauma at the nation, community, family, and individual levels, and then also how it progresses from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. So I'll give you a minute to look at this, and then we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Melita. I'm gonna put it along to the next slide.
Okay, so this is Epigenetics 101 right here, this clip. It describes epigenetics at the cellular level and how these changes happen over time and what the outcomes are for experiencing the change at the cellular level.
Here's a conundrum. Identical twins originate from the same DNA, so how can they turn out so different, even in traits that have a significant genetic component? For instance, why might one twin get heart disease at 55 while her sister runs marathons in perfect health? Nature versus nurture has a lot to do with it, but a deeper related answer can be found within something called epigenetics. That's the study of how DNA interacts with a multitude of smaller molecules found within cells, which can activate and deactivate genes. If you think of DNA as a recipe book, those molecules are largely what determine what gets cooked when. They aren't making any conscious choices themselves. Rather, their presence and concentration within cells makes the difference. So how does that work? Genes in DNA are expressed when they're read and transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins by structures called ribosomes. And proteins are much of what determines a cell's characteristics and function. Epigenetic changes can boost or interfere with the transcription of specific genes. The most common way interference happens is that DNA, or the proteins it's wrapped around, gets labeled with small chemical tags. The set of all of the chemical tags that are attached to the genome of a given cell is called the epigenome. Some of these, like a methyl group, inhibit gene expression by derailing the cellular transcription machinery or causing the DNA to coil more tightly, making it inaccessible. The gene is still there, but it's silent. Boosting transcription is essentially the opposite. Some chemical tags will unwind the DNA, making it easier to transcribe, which ramps up production of the associated protein. Epigenetic changes can survive cell division, which means that they could affect an organism for its entire life. Sometimes that's a good thing. Epigenetic changes are part of normal development. The cells in an embryo start with one master genome. As the cells divide, some genes are activated and others inhibited. Over time, through this epigenetic reprogramming, some cells develop into heart cells and others into liver cells. Each of the approximately 200 cell types in your body has essentially the same genome, but its own distinct epigenome. The epigenome also mediates a lifelong dialogue between genes and the environment. The chemical tags that turn genes on and off can be influenced by factors including diet, chemical exposure, and medication. The resulting epigenetic changes can eventually lead to disease if, for example, they turn off a gene that makes a tumor-suppressing protein. Environmentally induced epigenetic changes are part of the reason why genetically identical twins can grow up to have very different lives. As twins get older, their epigenomes diverge, affecting the way they age and their susceptibility to disease. Even social experiences can cause epigenetic changes. In one famous experiment, when mother rats weren't attentive enough to their pups, genes in the babies that help them manage stress were methylated and turned off. And it might not stop with that generation. Most epigenetic marks are erased when egg and sperm cells are formed. But now, researchers think that some of those imprints survive, passing those epigenetic traits on to the next generation. Your mother's or your father's experiences as a child or choices as adults could actually shape your own epigenome. But even though epigenetic changes are sticky, they're not necessarily permanent. A balanced lifestyle that includes a healthy diet, exercise, and avoiding exposure to contaminants may, in the long run, create a healthy epigenome. It's an exciting time to be studying this. Scientists are just beginning to understand how epigenetics could explain mechanisms of human development and aging, as well as the origins of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, addiction, and many other conditions. Meanwhile, new genome editing techniques are making it much easier to identify which epigenetic changes really matter for health and disease. Once we understand how our epigenome influences us, we might be able to influence it too.
So this clip talked about, the past two clips talk about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and how these two kind of contribute and play a role in the outcomes of a lot of socioeconomic and health in Indigenous communities. So if you can understand how these changes happen at the cellular level and the outcomes of these changes, and then you're able to better understand these disparities that are happening in Indigenous and Native communities. So like the clip said, we're beginning to understand these epigenomes, things that occur in our body, and it's kind of like the beginning of something serious to come probably in the next couple of years. Epigenetics is really something that's kind of increased as far as things that people study. And so these are kind of the outcomes that we see, like 60 to 70% of Native peoples don't live on reservations. And when compared to all other races, American Indians and Alaska Natives have experienced they have a lower life expectancy by 5.5 years. And Native Americans and Alaska Native youth they have a suicide rate at 2.5 times higher than the rest of the country. And we have the highest youth suicide rate among all race and ethnicities in the country. And the percentage of American Indian and Alaska Native living in poverty in 2017 was estimated to be about 26.8%, which compares with 14.6% for the nation as a whole. And this next one is really, really critical in understanding socioeconomic and health outcomes, because 19.4% of American Indian and Alaska Native children live in multi-generational homes. This was in 2018. So that kind of explains how we're still a very, very communal people. So we kind of, tend to experience what our families are experiencing because we live in multi-generational homes. And American Indians and Alaska Natives attend post-secondary education at a rate of 17%, which compares to 60% among the US total population.
Thank you, Molita. And I think one really important thing to take away from these statistics is that when we consider the historical and the socio-political context of federal Indian boarding schools, we can start to really disrupt that deficit mindset. When we look at these statistics, it might be easy to think something's wrong with our Native students, right? Something's wrong with the communities. But when we really take into account that context is when we can move away from those deficit mindsets and think about how, well, a lot of the strengths that Native communities had to work through a lot of these health and socioeconomic disparities in most places were intentionally taken away in in federal Indian boarding schools. So that's where some of the disparities, we can start to see some of the root causes, right? And so I'm going to pass it over to Linda to introduce our next reflection activity.
So we just have obviously gone through quite a bit of content with you, as well as the science of epigenetics with that. And we really want you to just take a moment and reflect again on that concept of what are our responsibilities as educators towards Indigenous and Native peoples, especially in regards to knowing now some of the history of American federal boarding schools. And then how does that play into what we do as educators in the public school system? And so take a moment and reflect. We'd love to hear some of your answers in the chat. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to do this. And then at that point, we're going to move on with just some last important kind of things, again, talking about trauma, but we wanted to give you some time to ask questions of Professor Pino.
Again, we know we shared a lot of, yes, thank you so much for those that are sharing in the chat. A lot of information, right? That might not feel necessarily connected to our everyday in classrooms, but we're hoping that by considering this specific question, we can start to connect your experience, your context in wherever you are in the state of Arizona to some of this historical and trauma-informed information we've been sharing.
I like Enrique's rebuilding trust and making meaningful relationships. I think that's a key piece to it.
Definitely.
Importance of students have that sense of belonging. I think that's where you bring in, multiple perspectives, especially Indigenous perspectives. I think is a huge one. I like Kim's respect of cultural differences, giving, them every opportunity that we can.
Mm-hmm. Valuing the rich cultural experiences of our Native families, understanding the historical trauma can help in relationship building, right? It helps you be considerate of how those relationships have been harmed in the past.
Yeah, I like that gets to Rebecca's comment about teach the whole child and understand the family. Again, that pulls that into it.
Definitely. And historically, right, families were not treated as experts, or in fact, the federal Indian boarding schools attempted to sever that connection. So how can we bring families into schooling, right, and into the process of education, I think is a great point.
These are all fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone that has shared their thoughts.
And I know I will be going back and looking at these. Okay, I think with that, we'll continue to move forward so that we can have plenty of time with our community expert. But in closing, we just want to end kind of our learning today with this idea of the importance of trauma-informed education. But we do want to be mindful of that we are talking about being trauma-informed, not being trauma-specific. We just want to have this kind of caveat here that we're not advocating that you try and diagnose or identify the specific trauma that your Native students have gone through. That's not necessarily appropriate or our role and responsibility as an educator, right? But we can be trauma-informed when we think about creating a safe and supportive environment, recognizing the trauma that has happened and how this has impacted, as we said at the top, nearly every tribal community and Native person in the United States. So how can we be mindful of that moving forward without re-traumatizing or causing harm? And we just want to leave that note as we close our time and before session 2, where we talk about specific teaching and classroom guidance.
I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording so that way people feel more open to ask questions, knowing that it won't be recorded.
Perfect. Oh, great. So thank you so much for your questions. Please continue to reach out to us if you'd like. We will be sharing our contact information in just a moment.
So we ask that you complete our survey that we have here as a QR code on the screen, and Helen will drop that direct link into the chat for you. This will definitely be something that will help us to guide our trainings for part 2, which are still available for registration, which we've put the link into the chat as well. So that's all of the trainings we still have left. We do have it broken down by grade band. Also for your attendance, if you can at this point in time as well, please put your first and last name into the chat. I'd appreciate it. That helps me double check that I've got you all here. Yeah, Helen, can you put the...
Yep, I'm going to drop it a few
That is
times because people's names will be going through.
Perfect.
I also
Yes.
want to very quickly do say, someone asked on the Mentimeter, is this training available to be brought to schools? And yes, we are all available to come to your school site and engage with your specific school community around this topic if you're interested.
Yep.
So I'm going to drop the link in a few more times just because everyone's names are flowing in, but
Perfect. Yeah. So wait until you get that email from us that says that your attendance, because right now it's just going to show that your attendance is that you have attended, but it won't be complete until we actually go in and change that into the system. And like Helen said, we are available to come to schools and districts for training, and we have all of our contact information here on the screen for you. Please feel free to email us at any point in time with questions. And we definitely want to say thank you so much for your time, your attention, for sharing with us in this space that we know we went over some pretty difficult and hard topics and conversations. And we do appreciate you taking that time to be present with us today. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.